All right, we're in Acts chapter 23 tonight. Again, each chapter kind of leads you to look at the next chapter. And chapter 23 is no different. I believe I said last week that Paul has breathed his last complete breath as a free person, as a free man, for the remainder of the time. Though he may not be in actual prison, though much of the time he's under Roman control and he's under Roman custody. They now have him, and that's the same. That's the same in chapter 23. So let's take a look. Verse 1. And Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in good conscience before God unto this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. For sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And they that stood by said, Revilest thou the high priest, God's high priest? Then Paul said, I did not know, brethren, that he was the high priest. For it is written, Thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of the people. Stop there for a second. So, right away, this chapter opens with some action. Paul finally gets a chance to complete the sermon that he wanted to preach to the group when he was interrupted, if you remember. He'd almost had a chance when he quieted the crowd down, but then they interrupted him and took him away. Well, now he gets to pick up where he left off. When we read that the high priest instructed him to be struck on the mouth, literally to slap him in the mouth, was because his statement came across as though, hey, I'm perfect. I don't have any sin. So, of course, they considered that blasphemy. But all he was saying was that he really, he had a clear conscience before God. Not that he was living perfectly, but that he was trying. What had changed in his life now since he was a Christ follower is he was aware of when he sinned and he's trying to correct that. So, and everywhere he went where he made a mistake, he'd go back and try to correct it or not make the mistake to begin with. So that's what he meant. He was simply saying that he had a clear conscience now before God. But, you know, he'll later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, he says that he knows nothing about himself or by himself, but it's the Lord who judges me. That's 1 Corinthians 4:4. So he knows that he's accountable to the Lord, and he's not perfect, but he's just simply saying, I have a good conscience now. If I make a mistake or if I sin, then I go by, I correct it. He was a man of good conscience, and this was evident by his speech, by his countenance, by his actions. He went about, again, parallel with the Lord Jesus, he went about doing good, and God backed up his life with signs and wonders. But it was an illegal order by Jewish law. He who strikes the cheek of one Israelite strikes, as it were, the glory of God. So what the high priest, Ananias, who was the high priest at the time, by the way, this high priest did no justice or honor to the office of high priest. History records that he was well known for his greed. The ancient historian Josephus, so I put a lot of stock in his writings, tells how Ananias stole for himself the tithes that belonged to the common priests. He'd go in and help himself to the collection plate of what the priest shared. So he didn't have scruples. He also, Josephus said, used violence, assassination to further his interests. And because of his pro-Roman politics, he eventually was brutally killed by some Jewish nationalists, and he lost his life. So to him, Paul spoke right back and said, God will strike you of sitting trying to judge me according to the law. In other words, You know, Paul knew the law better than he did. He knew that that was an illegal order. But what he didn't know, as he said, was he didn't know it was a high priest. Paul also knew that you were not to revile the high priest. So once he found out, he was more apologetic. But I wish we could have heard the tone of Paul's voice when he said that, so that we could have known more to be totally accurate and justified. The tone would have really let us in on whether it was an outburst of anger, was it a calm, collected rebuke, so that there'd be more weight to it. But whatever it was accurate and it was justified. Whitewashed wall was like a thin veneer of purity trying to cover up some obvious corruptions. So he was really calling the man out. Because the men of the council who Ananias was representing were supposed to be examples of the law of Moses. Both the groups we looked at a moment ago were supposed to be examples of the law of Moses. And contrary to Deuteronomy 25, 1 and 2, we're not to, only a man found guilty could be beaten. Not why he's being questioned, not why he's getting a chance to tell his side of the story. And Paul hadn't been found guilty of anything. So, but they corrected him about who he was speaking to. You know, this is not to be too hard on Paul, not recognizing who the high priest was. By the way, a couple different ways of looking at this. He'd been out of the brother group, or he'd been out of the group, the club of Pharisees for about 20 years. So he might not have recognized what the man looked like. Or the other thing is, we know from the inference of Galatians 4 and Galatians 6, and from early written tradition, that Paul's weakness in the flesh, not messenger that buffeted him, but maybe his weakness in the flesh could have been his eyesight. So he might not have seen clearly as to who this was, because in all likelihood, Paul's eyesight grew worse the older he got. Others think Paul was being sarcastic, but he might have been saying, when he said, I didn't know you were the high priest, he might have been inferring, I didn't think anyone who could act in such a manner as you would be a high priest. Could have been that. So I said, I wish we kind of knew the tone of his voice. But Paul perceived and read his audience that they were not conducive, now this is important, to receiving the gospel at this time. So he switched gears. He said, he read his audience, he recognized, and I think we can do that too when we're talking with someone. Sometimes the time's just not right. Sometimes the mood's not right. Sometimes the spirit's not leading. Just the opposite of that, sometimes it is, you know. But I think we need to be sensitive of those times. So right at this moment, Paul kind of goes off from what he was going to say into goes down another road. Kind of like what happened Sunday, you know, this past Sunday here at our church. I put them back in my, no, I didn't. I didn't get to a single one of my notes from Sunday morning because we went a different way, because I just felt the Spirit was leading that way. Well, the same thing here. Before I forget, let's get back to that. So Paul changes right here. I want you to look at Pharisees and Sadducees we hear a lot about. Look at all the other groups. Look at all the other groups that were part of that day. The Zealots, the Essenes, the bottom right here, very mystical group. I think they fasted more than they ate. They lived out in the wilderness. They tried to live a very simple life. They thought heaven could be found in living a simple life and being mystics and meditating. The Gnostics on the bottom left over here, the Herodians, all of them. That's the groups of political and religious parties that, you know, and then way down at the bottom's the common people, you and me. And so that's the different groups that Paul was dealing with. And that's kind of the pecking order. The Sanhedrin was the council, we've talked about that. Then the chief priests, and then under the chief priests, of course, were all the other ones, including the elders and those who practice Hellenic practices. So I thought that was important. So Paul changes here. Let's get back to that. He changes gear. here's what he did. I've said before, Paul was gifted, Paul was called, Paul was chosen, and in that chosen, God chose the whole Paul, the part of him that was stubborn, the part of him that was loyal, and the part of him that was very intelligent. Verse 6, but when Paul perceived that the one part was Sadducee and the other Pharisee, he cried out to the men in the council, men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am called into question. And when he had said so, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. So Paul immediately, these two groups of folks that did not like each other, that were combining to come at him, just as they had combined for a common purpose to come at Jesus, he was able to divide them because of his knowledge. I think this is an example where Jesus instructed the disciples to be wise as serpents, but harmless as doves. That doesn't mean evil as serpents, but wise as serpents. So Paul realized who his audience was, and then he brought up the fact he was a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and of course the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, but the Sadducees did not. So they were divided. Verse 8, the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirit. They didn't believe in anything in the spirit realm. But the Pharisees confessed both. And there arose a great cry. And the scribes that were of the Pharisee part rose and strove, saying, we find no evil in this man. But if a spirit or angel had spoken to him, let us not fight against God. So Paul aligned himself with the Pharisees, knowing they wouldn't be able to stay against him combined like that once he had divided them against himself based on what they believed. So, verse 10 says, there arose a great dissension, and the chief captain, fearing that literally he thought Paul was going to be pulled apart in front of him because they were tugging on him. Hope we get that picture. This was very violent times. These crowds could often be violence, the mob mentality, and there weren't any laws of political correctness in effect then where they couldn't touch Paul. He was afraid he was going to be pulled apart. So he had the soldiers go down and rescue him and take him, verse 10 says, by force from among them. Then, oh, this is great what happened next. Verse 11. And the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, be of good cheer, Paul, for thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome. How comforting must that have been for the Lord to make an appearance to Paul and comfort him. And it was Jesus himself. That's why in your Bible you probably find the words are in red there in verse 11. Jesus himself stood by him and told him, cheer up. I've been with you in Jerusalem, and you're going to testify of me also at Rome. So look what happens next. And when it was day, certain of the Jews, here again, this group of Jews that continue to hound him chapter after chapter, look what they do now. Banded together and bound themselves under a curse, saying they wouldn't eat or drink till they'd killed Paul. When I reread that this week, you know what I immediately thought of? Jezebel in the Old Testament, telling Elijah that if he was not as her dead men were by this time tomorrow, she swore an oath to make his life. So there was nothing about this group of Jews that was godly. Binding themselves together under an oath, under a curse, verse 12 says, that they would eat nothing or drink nothing until they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 which made this conspiracy. So Paul's on a hit list here on earth. We know he's on the devil's hit list. But now he's got 40 men that have swore with an oath that they would kill him. Wow. Let's read on. Verse 15. Now therefore, What the council signified to the chief captain, he would bring you down tomorrow, as though we would require something more perfectly concerning him. We're going to question him more. And we are ever come near, are ready to kill him. There's a trap being set here. And when Paul's sister's son heard them lying in wait, he went into the castle and told Paul. Paul's nephew came and said, hey, somebody's got it out for you. Verse 17, then Paul called one of the centurions unto him and said, bring this young man to the chief captain, for he hath certain things to tell him. And he took him, brought him to the chief captain, and said, Paul the prisoner called unto him and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, and has something to say. And the chief captain took him by the hand and went with him privately and said, what is it you want to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldest bring down Paul tomorrow to the council. They say it is to require something of him more perfectly. But do not yield unto them, for they lay in wait more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath that they'll neither eat nor drink until they have killed him. And now they are ready, looking for a promise from thee. Wow. What rascals, huh? God works in different ways and in different methods. In this particular case, he allowed a relative of Paul's to overhear the plan and to be the means of which he would rescue him. God doesn't always use the miraculous. He uses different circumstances to bring about his will. And in this particular case, he used his nephew, who simply went to the man in charge and said, look, they're asking you to they want to interview Paul some more and get some more info. That's not true. It's an ambush. It was no accident that this happened. God was bound by his own word in verse 11 that Paul was going to go to Rome. So it wasn't Paul's time to give up his life yet. And this was the way that God would protect him. Paul had committed no crime, yet here he was a prisoner. Because the Roman commander suspected he might be a revolutionary of some kind, he was kept in custody until these facts could be discovered. But while this was happening, you know, these 40 fellows, it was a sin. These guys should have been, they were Jews, they should have been committed to the law of God, and yet they were happy to sin against him. They were zealous, they had a lot of ambition, they had a lot of energy, but it was energy truly without knowledge, because there was nothing godly about it. So verse 22, so the chief captain, let the young man depart, and charged him, see that thou tell no man that thou hast showed these things to me. And he called to the 2 centurions and said, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and the horsemen 80, and the spearmen 200, and at the third of the night, provide them beasts, that they may set Paul on and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. And then Luke records the actual letter. He said, write a letter, verse 25, in this manner. And he tells Felix why he's sending Paul to him. Claudius Lysia, the most excellent governor Felix, sendeth greeting. This man was taken of the Jews and would have been killed by them, but I came with an army and rescued him, understanding that he was a Roman. Remember last week we talked about all the advantages that a Roman had over just anyone else. They automatically inherited certain things just by being a Roman citizen. And when I would have known the cause that they accused him, I brought him in front of their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or bonds. Who does that sound like again? Pontius Pilate. Amen. That's right, Bobby. Examining Jesus and saying, I find no fault in him. So again, we have yet another reference of similarity between Paul and Jesus. So, then the soldiers, it was commanded, took Paul, brought him by night to Antipatris, and on the morning they left the horsemen go with him and returned to the castle. And when they had come to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. And when the governor read the letter, he asked him what province he was, and he understood that he was of Cilicia. I will hear thee, said he, when thine accusers are also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall. So in an effort to be fair, he wanted the accuser and the accused to be at the same place, so that he could hear what their complaint was about him, and whether or not it was true, if they were making it up or if it was fair. So that was at least a imitation of fairness that he was trying to do. Okay, let's talk about it now.